We have a lot that we need to talk about this week, but we need to start it off by talking about something that just happened in heavy metal news that was announced earlier today, and that's the acquisition of Century Media Records by Sony for $17 million. Now, Century Media is kind of the Hollywood, I guess, of heavy metal record labels. It was formed in the late 1980s and slowly really kind of built a reputation of being where a lot of the bands that were kind of on the forefront of breaking out and becoming a pretty big deal ended up going. They released compilations such as the Identity compilation in order to really promote their artists, and especially here in metal's resurgence into the 2000s, they have had a couple of bands that they have been a part of or have had signed to the label really give them some great numbers, such as Shadows Fall, Lacuna Coil, and as of most recent, bands such as Whitechapel and Suicide Silence, I believe. Now, this has obviously been something that has been grassroots that also had a little bit of help along the way. There have been some subsidiaries that they have had some close association with. They had, of course, at one point had an association with Nuclear Blast. They have associations with Inside Out, which is a progressive label, as well as a couple of others. So this is an acquisition that is a big deal to a lot of metal fans because there is a huge difference still in the minds of metal fans and music fans alike. There's a big difference between Sony, which is very commercial, very corporate, one that definitely seems to gear a little bit more toward trying to have their own and a hand sort of in the cookie jar, their own slice of the pie, their own idea as to what things should be and what they should be all about, and have very clear-cut goals. Whereas with Century Media, they knew what they were. They knew that they were a heavy metal record label and that this is a style of music that does not necessarily sell with the same number of units and hangs with the big boys, supposedly, or as they say, of pop, rock, and rap. So this acquisition, what does it mean? It really can go a couple of different ways, and if you're wondering why I'm even talking about this, I have a degree from West Virginia Wesleyan College in business, and so that doesn't qualify me for shit, but it does qualify me enough to feel as though the opinions that I have about this make a little bit of sense, and what I really want to say and talk about is what this could potentially mean for Century Media and the artists on this label. And there's two different ways that this can go, and this is something I want to mention before everybody starts to panic, even though I think that's already started to happen. The first way that this can go is that Century Media's acquisition for $17 million is something where Sony wants to get in onto this market. They want to kind of build a division up and actually be able to supply Century Media with a little bit more of the way of fundage, either that or a little bit more of promotional capability in order to get these artists that Century Media has been able to foster and really give a lot. And they have some numbers to prove that, especially whenever it comes to groups such as Lacuna Coil, and kind of give them a little bit more than they had previously available to them, and sort of give this company and give this label a little bit more strength, and give them the opportunity to really either expand their horizons or even go after some bigger name talent, and where it will seem that they will have a little bit more resources at their disposal, which could make some bigger bands want to turn towards Century Media with that Sony partnership in order to go forward with their career. It also gives Sony yet another division within the heavy metal department. They had a relationship with EMI, which is a relationship that also was shared with Century Media. So there was already a bit of a prior connection there, albeit it was a bridge that seemed to be in the background that nobody really crossed and nobody really identified, nobody really wanted to talk about all of that much. So there is something that is already present there. So this is a partnership that actually makes a lot of sense in that regard and could actually end up doing a lot of bands on Century Media a favor. It could actually help them a little bit more with the promotion. It could help them a little bit more with funding, and the only real difficulty that many people could see is the fact that with those increased amounts or that increased capability, it also means that more is going to be demanded from these artists, more is going to be taken from them in order to cover all of these overhead costs, and finally, if the sales thresholds and the sales units do not match up to Sony's expectations, we're going to see a turnover rate of a lot of the bands on the roster and see Century Media essentially denigrate itself into a very popular heavy metal label as opposed to being one that is very diversified. That's one way to look at it. That is the way in which Century Media, for the most part, would just have expectations from Sony directly, but for the most part still be allowed to run their business the way in which they do. Now we look at the other side, which is where I think more people are leaning and why more people are freaking out. This is where Sony, instead of just insinuating and instituting the sales threshold ideas and really expecting a lot more from their artists, considering they're giving them a little bit more, now also expect a little bit of creative control. Now actually want to be able to sit down with these artists in creative meetings and things like that and negotiate a potential change or shift of their sound. So basically their expectations are no longer something that is just relative to album sales or relative to the amount that they will be making through merchandise or say concert tickets sold, things of that variety, things that they do have a stake in, but it's now something where they want to control a little bit of what the music sounds like and actually want to try to market these bands toward a sound that they think sells a little bit better. If that happens to be the case, and that control is sort of becomes a little bit more restrictive to the artist and a little bit more geared toward trying to kind of satisfy the bigwigs and satisfy what's big, as opposed to doing their own thing and staying true to their own sound, then you're going to see a lot of bands perhaps release some albums that sound very out of character. Either that, or you could see what exactly happened to thrash metal and what happened to the heavy metal explosion in the late 1980s whenever they started to get signed to some bigger labels. This was an experiment that didn't last very long, principally because if you note, most of the albums released on those bigger labels had a marked difference, whether it be in sound, whether it be in quality. Something did not gel, something didn't feel right, something did not make sense, and that was because there was more industry control within that music as opposed to it being a little bit more freeing for the artists themselves. Now obviously any label is going to try to push a band a little bit toward their own core sound or perhaps suggest something a little bit brand new, but if there's one thing that you don't see with heavy metal labels is really a desire, a clamoring, a demand for singles, and a demand for them to be available on the double and sound a certain way to make them marketable. So that's where everybody's freaking out. That's why everybody thinks that there's going to be mass exoduses away from this label, bands trying to opt out of their contract. Either that or groups that have that marked difference in their sound and end up not selling as well because of that change, which will then cause Sony to simply drop them and reinstitute new bands that satisfy a little bit more of that popular and profitable aesthetic. Two ways that can really go. There's probably other paths that can be taken that are a bit of an amalgamation of that. It could be one that's very artist specific, whether or not they treat it as such. Myself personally, I really see this acquisition as Century Media reacting to one of the losses of one of their founders, in the fact that it's now just a one man out of the two that's really in control here, and that was something that occurred last year. So I believe that this match was something that always had the capability and always had the possibility of happening, considering there are those loose bridge connections between Sony and Century Media, even if it's something that nobody really wanted to even imagine. It's something that's there through EMI, almost as the center point of this, based around some of the distribution that occurs between both of these labels. So this, I think, makes a little bit of sense, but it is worrisome for heavy metal fans, considering that idea of big company control is one that has not worked out well in the past for heavy metal bands that have been treasured. It's something where there have been very few groups that seem to have emerged from this age unfazed, and while some of the others that were phased a bit still released some pretty cornerstone albums in the heavy metal genre by itself, the overall taste was not a pleasant one, so it causes a lot of concern. And people are concerned mainly that history is going to repeat itself with some of these groups. For right now, I think everything's going to be just fine. But I think what you need to kind of keep an eye on, if you really keep an eye on this stuff, if it's something that interests you, is keep an eye on how the next couple of years really transpire between some of the artists that are on Century Media, maybe some of the new artists that they're able to kind of steal away or kind of attract to the label, and then see how the sales thresholds go, and more so see how the sales thresholds affect their allegiance to the fraternity of the Century Media label. That's where I would be the most interested to see just how long the leash truly will be. But for right now, I'm not freaking out too much about it. This could be a really, really good thing for the artists on Century Media. It could be something that makes Century Media more of an on-demand label to try to attain to be a part of, as opposed to being one that kills the label. So we just have to see. I would silence freaking out for right now. But we'll just have to see. What do you guys think about this? What are your thoughts? Which one of the two ideas that I just presented do you think will actually occur? Or do you have your own thoughts on what you think will occur? Let me know in the comments below. And this is going to be something that's going to be talked about for a little while, I think, considering Century Media's reputation has already been one that a lot of metal fans have an opinion about, considering the bands that they've had and where they really seem to push, what they really don't seem to push. As I said, it has a very Hollywood of heavy metal feel to it already. And now them being picked up by Sony just seems as though, Tinseltown has gotten another big building. So let me know what you think in the comments below. We'll talk about this a little bit more on Cover Killer Nation. This has been Cover Killer Nation Reacts. I'll talk to you later.